Greetings, scholars. It's Brian again. I just wanted to check in and talk with you about the origins of advocacy. Really, when we're talking about the origins of advocacy, we're talking about ancient Greek culture. And I really want to talk about three different things today. I want to talk about the origins of rhetoric, I want to talk about Aristotle, and I want to move into how we approach rhetoric today. Now, you probably have some background with ancient Greece. You've heard about it from the Greek city-states, whether you learned about them in history or even in popular culture. There are plenty of exposures and plenty of Hollywood movies that explore the topics of ancient Greece, all kinds of different exposure there. But I want to talk about the necessity of an oral culture in ancient Greece. One of the things that we often take for granted in a lot of these popular culture portrayals is the necessity of an oral culture that was going on during that time. As there was an oral culture, there was also a need for public speaking and public address. And rhetoric has a great part to play in that. In fact, rhetoric is the oldest subject ever taught. We can date it back to 444 before the current era, to the teachings of Tisias and Corax, who was an instructor in ancient Greece who taught people how to accuse others of wrongdoing in the public forum, or on the other side, how to defend oneself against accusations of wrongdoing if you were accused. And this was really because of the Greek city-state legal structure, in which every citizen had the right to accuse other citizens in the courts, and on the other hand, every citizen had to be able to defend themselves. So if you're in a situation where you can be attacked, you need to know how to defend, or if you're going to be in a situation, you might need to know how to accuse others if there's wrongdoing that's done to you. Now, onto this scene in ancient Greece enter a group of teachers who traveled around the country teaching this art of public speaking and other things, and they were called the Sophists. The Sophists were folks like Protagoras, Corax, Tisias, Isocrates, Gorgias. They taught and lived from around the 5th to the 3rd century before the current era. They were people who traveled around in ancient Greek city-states teaching the idea of wisdom. They often had their own educational system that involved grammar, logic, or dialectic. Remember, they didn't really have science at that time, as well as rhetoric. Now, you might think, hey, that's kind of interesting, but this is actually the first instance of public education that was known on the planet. Before this, there was education for rulers, but citizens themselves couldn't really retain teachers before these sophists exist. Now, very early on, these sophists developed a bad reputation. Folks from the elite culture of Athens and other city-states began to accuse these sophists of selling wisdom. They had the horrible notion that they might be able to teach people to make an oral argument to make the weaker case appear to be the stronger, or as horrible as it might sound, to be able to convince people that something which was untrue was actually likely to be true. It's a horrible, horrible situation. Among the chief critics of the Sophists was Plato, a student of Socrates during that time and philosopher that you've probably read about in other contexts. He was not a fan of rhetoric. He viewed these sophists as selling important skills that really ought to be better left to philosopher kings who could figure out the important issues of truth and falsity, dialectic and logic and things like that. Plato famously compared rhetoric to cooking, and not cooking in a lofty sense, but rather something that appealed to people's base emotions. He had a very negative outlook on what these sophists were doing. And if we left the story there, we probably wouldn't be studying rhetoric to this day, as Plato thought it was subservient to the search for truth, which he called philosophy. However, Plato's student did have a different outlook. I'm talking about Aristotle. Aristotle wrote on many different works. He wrote famously about rhetoric, and he had a very different view than his teacher. He viewed the relationship between rhetoric and the search for truth as complementary. He wrote that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic or logic, that it's not opposed to it, it is part of that process. As I said last week, Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of observing in any given case the best available means of persuasion. And what that meant for Aristotle was that rhetoric is not persuasion, it's finding the best persuasion given the particular situation. Aristotle was a person who tried to catalog and characterize different things. And so he tried to characterize rhetoric into all kinds of different series or genres of speech. He identified three different types of speech to begin with. The first of those being forensic. Forensic speech, that was speeches that concern the past, and typically they involve the area of justice. If you've ever seen a courtroom speech, a defense speech, summing up its partner, my client was not here and did not do the murder and all those things, that was a forensic speech. Anytime you've seen a crime drama, you've seen forensic speech in action. The second category Aristotle identified was called epideictic. The epideictic speeches are speeches of honor or praise or blame. These are speeches that are given at eulogies or after dinner speaking. They're the special occasion speech. They typically have a very, very different structure than the forensic speech. The third category that Aristotle identified is the deliberative speech. These are speeches that discuss a course of action, and they primarily take as their value utility. These three different types of speeches Aristotle identified as genres, and he said that they have different expectations and they affect audiences differently the way that they are organized. Aristotle was a great characterizer. He also said that rhetoric has different types of appeals that it may work on. It may rely on ethos, or ethical appeals based on the person speaking. It may rely on logos, or logical appeals, the use of rationality. Or further, rhetoric may rely on pathos appeals. Pathos is our root for empathy, and also pathetic. It's emotional appeals that go on for things. Aristotle brought a very different view of rhetoric, that it's something that could be useful if we just understood its different working parts and its different elements. Now, today, we have a much broader sense of rhetoric. We talk about rhetoric not only as a subject, but also as a perspective. And just as Plato and Aristotle had different definitions of rhetoric, there are many different definitions that exist today. And that's probably normal because it's a concept that exists only with human society. And as human society changes, our understanding of rhetoric is also changing. That's one of the things that makes advocacy challenging, but also so exciting. The textbook that we're using from Keith and Lundberg says that rhetoric is the study of producing discourses and interpreting how, when, and why discourses are persuasive. So again, there's that focus on persuasion, but a little bit of a different angle there than Plato or Aristotle. Well, here you've got a snapshot of a bunch of different views from the origins of rhetoric, how it was intimately tied to the city structure, the legal structure of the Greek city-states, and how it went under criticism and then a kind of reconstruction in its philosophical appeals and whether or not it could be useful for finding truth. What do you think? We've got a number of activities that we're set up for in this module to help us explore the benefits and the drawbacks of rhetoric, especially focusing on that early time period as we start to move forward to look at our own examples of advocacy in action. Good luck, scholars.